By 1953, the cats of Minamata had begun to die strangely. They walked sideways down the narrow lanes between the fishermen's houses. They convulsed. Some of them tried to dance. That was the term the townspeople used. Others simply collapsed and were still. A few walked into the sea. The crows came next. They began falling from the sky over the harbor. By the time the fishermen connected the cats to the crows, to themselves, 2 generations of their families had already been poisoned. This is the story of how that happened and how long it took anyone to admit it. Minamata is a small port town on the Yatsushiro Sea in southern Japan. In the early 20th century, it was a place of stone seawalls, narrow paths, and wooden houses. The men fished, the women cleaned the catch, the children played at the water's edge. The fish were everything: breakfast, dinner, currency, identity. In 1908, a new kind of building rose on the inland side of the bay. The Nippon Nitrogen Fertilizer Company, which would eventually be renamed Chisso, had come to Minamata to manufacture chemicals. By the 1930s, it was producing acetaldehyde, a chemical used in plastics, perfumes, and acetic acid. By 1951, it was producing 6,000 tons of acetaldehyde a year. The reaction required a catalyst. Chisso used mercury sulfate. The process was imperfect. A small fraction of the mercury was converted, in the course of doing its work, into methylmercury. The waste, including this methylmercury, was piped out of the plant and into Minamata Bay. There was no treatment, there was no regulation, there were no warnings. This continued, without interruption, from 1932. The town prospered. By the 1950s, Chisso employed a substantial share of Minamata's working-age population. The mayor was sometimes a former Chisso executive. The hospital was the Chisso Hospital. The town existed, in a real sense, at the corporation's pleasure. And below the seawalls, the methylmercury was building. Methylmercury does not pass through a living body. It accumulates. A small fish absorbs a small amount from the water and from its food. A larger fish eats hundreds of small fish and inherits all their mercury. A person who eats those fish every day for 30 years becomes a final cup. The first creatures to fall were the cats. Cats in fishing towns eat what their owners eat. By the early 1950s, the cat population along the bay was collapsing. Convulsions, paralysis, what locals could only call madness. They called it dancing cat disease. Households kept informal records of how many they had lost. The figures climbed. Then the seabirds began to fall. On the 1st of May 1956, the director of the Chisso Factory Hospital, a doctor named Hajime Hosokawa, formally notified the Minamata Public Health Center of an outbreak. 2 sisters, aged 5 and 2, had been admitted with severe neurological symptoms: dyskinesia, convulsions, dystonia of the hands and feet, sudden fits of screaming. They could not walk. They could not speak clearly. Their movements were violent and uncontrolled. Within months, dozens of patients across Minamata were presenting at the hospital with the same constellation of signs. The doctors had never seen it. They called it an unknown disease of the central nervous system. The first assumption was that it was infectious. This had a consequence the people of Minamata still remember. Affected families were ostracized, their houses were marked, their children were not allowed to play with other children. Neighbors moved away to avoid them. A disease whose actual cause was the food everyone ate had become, in the public imagination, a contagion of certain unfortunate households. Later studies would establish that the symptoms had been appearing in residents since 1953. By the time the first patient was formally reported, 17 of the 54 people who would be identified that year were already dead. In November 1956, 6 months after the first official report, a research team from Kumamoto University announced its preliminary finding. The disease was not infectious. It was poisoning. The agent was a heavy metal. The source, almost certainly, was the Chisso plant. Chisso responded by initiating its own investigation. Hosokawa, the same doctor who had filed the original report, was instructed to look into it. He did. In a private laboratory inside the plant, he fed Chisso's waste effluent to cats. The cats developed the dancing disease. He had, in effect, proven the company's guilt to himself. He reported his findings to his superiors. The experiment was ordered stopped. The records were ordered hidden. They would not surface for another decade. In the meantime, Chisso continued discharging waste into the bay. In 1958, the company quietly redirected its waste outflow to a different point, the mouth of the Minamata River. This did not stop the poisoning. It spread it. New cases appeared in fishing communities along an expanded stretch of coast. The fishermen, meanwhile, were beginning to organize. The Minamata Fishing Cooperative, many of whose members were themselves now ill, staged protests at the plant. They demanded that the dumping stop. Chisso responded with a one-time settlement, a sum that, divided across the affected families, came to relatively little. A clause in the agreement stipulated that the issue would not be raised again. In 1965, 400 miles north, the same disease began appearing along the Agano River in Niigata Prefecture, downstream of an acetaldehyde plant owned by a different company, Showa Denko. It was the same poisoning, in a different place, by a different corporation, using the same industrial process. In 1968, the Japanese government formally announced its conclusion. The disease was caused by methyl mercury. The sources were Chisso and Showa Denko. Acetaldehyde production at Minamata stopped that same year, but only because the chemical process itself had been replaced by a newer method that did not require mercury at all. 36 years had passed since the dumping had begun. By the time Chisso was formally confirmed as the cause, the company had stopped polluting not because it had been forced to, but because the technology had moved on. What followed was a half-century of lawsuits. The first wave came in 1969, when families of patients filed a class action against Chisso. The 1973 verdict found the company liable. Compensation began to flow. But the criteria for being certified as a victim were narrow, and the certification process was slow. Many of those affected, particularly those with mild or atypical symptoms, were rejected. In 1971, the American photographer Eugene Smith and his Japanese-American wife Aileen arrived in Minamata. They spent 3 years there. Their photo essay, published as a book in 1975, brought the disease to a global audience. One of Smith's photographs, of a mother bathing her severely disabled adult daughter, became one of the most reproduced documentary images of the 20th century. The family asked, decades later, that the image be retired from circulation. Most publishers respected that. By the 1990s, the legal architecture had grown thick with categories: certified patients, applicants for certification, those denied certification but receiving partial settlements, those receiving nothing at all. A 1995 government settlement and a 2009 Special Measures Act each attempted, partially, to widen recognition. Each was followed by new lawsuits arguing that the recognition was still too narrow. The official certified death toll from Minamata disease is roughly 1,800. The number of officially certified patients is around 2,300. The number of people who have applied for certification, been refused, and who are, by their own accounts and the accounts of independent researchers suffering from the disease, runs into the tens of thousands. The Chisso Corporation still exists. In 2011, it was restructured, splitting its current operations into a separate company called JNC in order to insulate ongoing business from the liability of its past. Minamata Bay was dredged from 1977 to 1990. Mercury-contaminated sediment was removed in enormous volumes and sealed beneath a landfill at the edge of the harbor. The landfill is now a park. Fishing eventually resumed in the cleaned waters. There is a museum in the town now. There are memorial stones. There is a name for the disease that everyone in Japan knows, and that has entered the international vocabulary of industrial poisoning. Minamata disease has become a synonym for a kind of disaster that takes a long time to admit. The story is often told as a Japanese story. It is more accurately told as a story about what corporations and governments do when an industrial process is profitable, and the people being harmed are politically distant from the people making the decisions. Versions of this story exist in many places. Most are less documented. Minamata's distinction is not that it happened. It is that the evidence was eventually allowed to surface. Dr. Hosokawa, the doctor who had filed the first report and then run the secret cat experiments, died in 1970. Before his death, he gave statements about what he had done and what he had been told to do. His testimony became part of the legal record in the lawsuits that followed. The cats walked sideways in the spring of 1953. The first patient was reported in May 1956. The official cause was acknowledged in 1968. The lawsuits are still being filed.